Before we dive into today's sermon, first a brief aside. Some of you may recall the sermon that I shared with you a couple weeks ago about the biblical case for full inclusion of transgender people in spiritual community. After that sermon, Carissa Munson, our tech person, took a 2-minute video outtake from that sermon and posted it on Instagram as a way of experimenting with how we might better project our message out into the world. So she posted that brief clip together with a link to the full sermon. A pastor in Florida, Pastor Kevin Conklin, who worshiped with us years ago, saw that, and he took his phone and filmed that 2-minute clip and then put it on TikTok. And oh my goodness, it has gone viral. This was like 4 or 5 days ago. It's like 4 or 5 days ago. It has already gotten over 100,000 hits. 22,000 plus likes and more than 900 comments, plus something that on TikTok they call duets. I think that's where somebody reposts it and then says something about it. Many of those. And when you read the comments, it will cause you to tear up. So many transgender people who are saying, this is the first message of spiritual hope I've heard in my life. And it's surprising how many self-identified atheists and agnostics are saying, you know, I'd kind of written off church, but if I was in Indianapolis, I would go to a church like this. I share this with you because it's a powerful example of why the world needs churches like ours, and it's a powerful example of what God can do through churches like ours. Thank you for being part of what's happening here. But now, let's turn our attention to our focus for today's sermon. During Holy Communion at her church one Sunday morning, Sherry Yates received the elements, the wafer and the juice, and consumed the elements, then immediately bowed her head, closed her eyes, and began to pray. Meanwhile, her 5-year-old son, Seth, infinitely curious, sitting next to her, is watching her like a hawk, trying to figure out what's this all about. Meanwhile, as she prayed, he was so still, she found herself thinking, is he misbehaving? So she peeked at him out of the corner of her eye and saw that he was now intently watching his father, who had received his elements, consumed them, bowed his head, closed his eyes, and began to pray. Sherry says, I thought to myself, this is so good. We're being such great parental examples for our son. Just then, she says, he leaned over to her and said, Mama, what's in that stuff? You eat it and go right to sleep. Many of us may have experienced Holy Communion as a kind of sleepy, repetitive, maybe even boring part of most worship services. You may have consciously or subconsciously found yourself wondering, what's with this? What am I missing? What are we supposed to be getting out of this? Why did Jesus decide to make Holy Communion the central aspect of Christian worship? The only specific instruction Jesus gave us about Christian worship was, do this in remembrance of me. Hold those questions for a second. A couple months ago, out of the blue, I got a call from Janine Parkins. Janine lives up north of Kokomo in Tipton, Indiana, and often worships with us online. She told me how, over the phone, how God has been awakening her to the importance of observing Holy Communion, not just as part of our formal worship experiences when we gather at church, but as an important part of her personal daily spiritual practice. She said to me, "Jeff, am I crazy?" By which she meant, am I off course on this? You've probably often heard me when I'm consecrating communion up here. You've often heard me say that on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, he took the cup, he blessed it, and he said to his disciples, "As often as you gather together, do this in remembrance of me." From the time I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I've heard hundreds of preachers consecrate communion that way, saying that Jesus said, "As often as you gather together, do this in remembrance of me." The implication being that communion is something we do when we come together at church. So when Janine said to me, "I'm doing this as a part of my personal spiritual practice on a daily basis," and asked me, "Is that crazy? Am I on the wrong course?" I said, "Well, let's check." And I started flipping through the New Testament scriptures that talk about Holy Communion, and I was startled to discover, you know how sometimes you're convinced that the Bible says something because you've heard it so many times, it's in there somewhere? I was startled to discover that nowhere in the Bible does Jesus say, "As often as you gather together, do this in remembrance of me." Instead, what he said, the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11:25, what he says instead is, Jesus took the cup also at the Last Supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Notice that phrase, "do this as often as you drink it." That means when you sit down to break bread and you lift the cup, remember me. In other words, Jesus envisioned this not as just something that we do when we come together, although that's wonderful, but something that should be a part of our everyday experience. That startled me. That surprised me. The Bible nowhere says that there has to be a priest present when we celebrate Holy Communion. What? When? How? At the start of today's sermon, we're going to have a brief conversation. I'm going to have a brief conversation with Janine so that she can share with us what God has laid on her heart. And then I'm going to take a few minutes to give us a quick overview of what Holy Communion is and means according to the Scriptures. Let's get started with a prayer. Jesus, open our eyes to better understand this thing called communion, so that we can live lives that better reflect what you hoped and dreamed for us, so that we can live fully the life of abundance that you promised us. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. So, Janine, thank you very much for being here with us today and to get us started. Share with us, walk us down the path that has led you to what is it that's been happening in your life that has emphasized to you the importance of communion as a daily personal spiritual practice? What brings you to this point?
Well, I think it started as a child, honestly. I've always been inquisitive, like most children, but mine was a little bit over. I was raised in a very strict religious background, and I was that child sitting there watching my parents going, "What is this? Nobody smiles here. They don't seem to be happy that they're doing this." And it started my Emmaus walk, I think. And I had a tough teenage period in my life where I was about 15 years old. And, oh wait, I have to go back one more. When I was about 12 years old, that inquisitiveness went overboard a little, maybe, I don't know. I went to my priest and I asked for a meeting with him in his big office. And I asked him lots of questions. And I kept saying, but that's not in the Bible. Where's that in the Bible? And I kept hearing, well, that's just the way we do it. And I thought, that's not a good enough answer. So he brought in another priest, and he said, help her. Just help her with this. She's asking me this, and just listen. And I asked another one, well, that's just the way we do it. And I was like, okay, but why do we have to stick our tongue out? Why do you have to put it on my tongue? Why do we, all these different things, the way they did the communion at that church. And then he invited another priest. I had 4 priests by the end of my office. And then they finally said, okay, thank you for coming. So my Emmaus walk has been one of questioning, probably like those men were. What's going on? And I had it in me. I just didn't have the answers yet. And then when I was 15, I was working at this place called House of Pies. And life was tough at home. I was many times thinking about ending my life. And one day this scraggly man came in and sat down at the counter, which I happened to be working that day, and he asked me, we talked for a little bit, and I was gonna I got him a drink, and I turned around and cut his pie, but I left it there, gave him the drink, and he started talking to me again, and then during the conversation towards the end of it, he said, I know what you're planning on doing, and don't do it, because God has something really big he wants to do through you. And I thought, crazy old man. I turned around. So, but then, through my life, I've realized that, I kept turning. I've never had the confidence to come up in front of anyone, but I knew that God was preparing me for it the whole time. And then, recently, I met my fiance, and we started to talk on I'll never forget, it was February 14th on Valentine's Day. We didn't have lovey-dovey conversation. We had a conversation about God and what he's been doing through my life. And I feel like the Emmaus happened then. All of a sudden I understood that there was more to share, and just even with each other. As a couple, the couple that prays together stays together. Communion, the couple that has communion together stays together too. And we started to have communion together. And I have to tell you, the way I was raised, it was tough at first. But because I was so formal. But that's how it started. And I think, like they said in the Emmaus Walk, the veil came off, and I was ready to start doing this ourselves.
So what prompted you then to call me a couple months ago?
I think it was because I realized there was more to it. It wasn't just for us. God had been preparing me all this time. I feel, and I've heard sermons about the gifts and things, and I knew mine was evangelism, which blew my mind because I did not think I was supposed to be up in front of people. But I came here because I've been here before. Years ago, I came to this church, and I feel like it's such an inclusive, wonderful place to be. You guys go through so much, so much judgment and so much. But this, I knew that was a place that everything would be accepted. But even a little bit more importantly was I trusted you. I've heard the word through this man. I told myself I wasn't going to cry, and I got through the crying part, but this time I got, don't look at me. No, and I feel his knowledge is really something that I respected. And he's right. I was thinking, what, God? This is not the way I was raised. Like I said, the first time I had communion, I felt like, okay, am I okay to do this? Yeah. And I did it, though, and it was an amazing experience. And God wanted me to share it with other people. And I went to you, and he was so funny because I was like, am I crazy? Because I don't see this online. I Googled it. I don't see this online. I don't see this in the Word. And he started to look through. He says, okay, well, hang on a second. And I heard this over the phone. okay, hang on a second. Well, okay, hang on one more minute. I think I got, okay, well.
I was looking for the part where Jesus said, whenever you gather together. I was sure it was there somewhere.
Yeah, okay. And I thought, okay, you don't see it either. So we've got something here, and I think that was our Emmaus walk.
So, nuts and bolts, when you and Michael celebrate communion together as part of your breakfast or lunch or a restaurant or whatever what do you do? Nuts and bolts.
Michael's been very obedient with this because I work for the state. And I'm the one that brought it to him. He told me not to do that. Take the mic away. I'm not used to having a mic. But Michael's very obedient about this. And he says in the morning I'll go log in because I work at home. And very stressful job. And he'll say, honey, do you want me to go make communion? Get it ready. And I'll say, no, not yet. Because I have stuff to do. And then he'll say, okay, let me know. And then I was like, maybe not today. And I've heard myself say that. And I thought, I don't have time for the Lord. Okay, honey, go make communion. So he'll go make toast, which we found is the best because it's dry. You can use anything, of course. We've been out of juice before and used water. But hey, Jesus changed water to wine. So we've used water. We've done that at home, and it's really interesting because we don't formally say any words, usually. It's just thinking about what Jesus, said to his apostles on that day. As he broke bread, he was thankful for it. He blessed it as we can bless it. You don't have to have somebody else do that. God's already blessed it by giving it to you. And we break it. And we think about what he did for us. Then we drink the juice and we think about that sacrifice. But I also think about how hard it had to be, at the Last Supper. So we experience communion. And then we've done it in public. We've gone to Taco Bell and broken off a tortilla. You get water, though, because it's kind of weird with Coke. I'm just saying. But Jesus told us to take a cup, and that's what we do. And I'm just looking forward to the day that we're in a restaurant and we see other people doing that by us.
Yeah.
How cool would it be?
Yeah.
You guys are the first ones I've spoke to about this.
Yeah, that's cool. So why do you think communion was so important to Jesus? It's the one instruction he gave us to perpetuate throughout the ages in Christian worship. The one specific instruction he gave us. Why was it so important to Jesus?
I think it was because he loved to share meals with everyone, just as we do. And he knew that time with his apostles was going to be the last time they were going to see him, last time he was going to see them. It was a special time. And he gave them something to give us to share, to remember his broken body, to remember his sacrifice, to remember his blood that was shed for us. And I am imagining now this going viral. Let's share this. Let's get it in our homes. Let's get it in the restaurants. Let's do this and make this the next big thing. Let's make Jesus the next big thing. He's celebrating, by the way. He's up there. Yes, they're getting it.
Somebody's finally listened to what I said. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's express our appreciation to Janine. Thank you. So now let's dig deeper into what the scriptures say about Holy Communion. One of the most striking things as you read through the four Gospels is how many stories are there, how many different stories are there about Jesus sharing meals with people. Clearly, table fellowship seemed like it was Jesus' favorite thing to do in the world. There are stories of Jesus sharing meals with his disciples, sharing meals with his followers and friends, with his family, with the Pharisees, with his spiritual opponents, his spiritual enemies, and most notoriously and most Scandalously, there are many stories of Jesus sharing meals with those who were considered unclean. For example, in Mark chapter 2, Mark tells us about a dinner party that Jesus went to that was hosted by Levi the tax collector. Mark chapter 2, verse 15, as Jesus sat at dinner at Levi's house, many other tax collectors and, quote, sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of those kind of people who were following Jesus. Now, understand that in Jesus' culture, saying that Levi was a tax collector means that he was a Jew who was collecting taxes from his fellow Jews on behalf of the occupying Roman forces. So Levi was seen as a traitor, as the lowest of the low, as scum, and tax collectors were regarded as unclean. But Jesus repeatedly in the Gospels shares these meals with people who are not religiously observant, who were considered the least likely. In fact, other Jews would refuse to share table fellowship with them because if you ate with someone who was unclean, that was believed to make you unclean. But Jesus did this so often, he became known as a friend of sinners. He did this so often that his enemies accused him, Matthew 11:19, of being a glutton, and a drunkard. Of course, that was a false charge. But if nothing else, these stories emphasize to us that Jesus was something of a foodie. Jesus is someone who loved good food, loved good table fellowship, loved gathering with whoever, including the most colorful characters in his culture. Again and again and again. In fact, in Luke chapter 14, Jesus tells a parable about what it's going to be like when God inaugurates the kingdom of heaven. And it's going to be launched with a great heavenly feast. And as Jesus tells this parable, he explains that there will be many religiously observant people who refuse to go to the heavenly feast. So, Jesus explains, the tables of heaven will be filled with, Luke 14:21, the poor, the crippled, the lamed, and the blind. Understand that in Jesus' culture, if you were physically disabled or sick, you were believed to be someone who was a sinner being punished by God. You were deemed unclean. Now here's Jesus turning the tables on the Pharisees and saying, it's the unclean people who are going to be disproportionately represented at the heavenly feast in the kingdom of God. Jesus loved sharing table fellowship with anybody, so much so that on the night before his crucifixion, when he had just a few hours left, the last most important thing he wanted to do was to share another meal with his disciples. We're told in Luke 22:15 that Jesus, at the start of that meal, the Last Supper, said to his disciples, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer. Note that phrase, eagerly desired. It was the last most important thing that Jesus wanted to do. Imagine what that meal must have been like as they laughed together, cried together, as they reminisced, as they worried together. What will the future bring? That deep connection and camaraderie. And it was in that context that Jesus said to his disciples, as often as you drink the cup, do this in remembrance of me. What's the this there, Jesus? If you were Jesus' disciples there at the Last Supper, experiencing all of that, and Jesus looked around the table and said, when I'm gone, I want you to keep doing this in remembrance of me, what would you have understood him to be saying? Oh, Jesus wants us, his followers, to continue being the kind of people who are known for relishing table fellowship with anyone, to living our lives connected, loving, communicating, commiserating, camaraderie, inclusively gathering around the table. Keep doing this in remembrance of me. And guess what? The earliest New Testament Christians, that's what they did. That's how they understood it. They didn't do communion in the stylized way that we're accustomed to in our worship services today. Instead, they did Holy Communion, those earliest Christians, historians tell us, they did it as a communal meal, an actual meal. They would bring food and pool it together, what we today would call a potluck. And they would celebrate. They called it agape feast, which translates into English as love feasts. They would break bread together. They would laugh. They would commiserate. They would connect, experience that camaraderie, and somewhere in the meal, like we're going to do at our potluck after service today, somewhere in the meal they would pause and they would remember. They would break the bread, they would lift the cup, and they would remember Jesus and give thanks for Jesus and acknowledge his presence with them. Do this in remembrance of me. So what happens? Within 150 years, historians tell us, as churches were built and it became less convenient when you were holding worship services in spaces like this, communion became stylized, which is fine. But the institutional church went a step further. And also, within 150 years after the time of Jesus, the institutional church declared that this meal forevermore was now open to members only. If you're not part of the club, you can't share the meal. And Jesus wept. Because Jesus shared his table with anybody and everybody. So what does the institutional church do? It turns around and says, if you're not a member, if you're not religiously observant, you are not welcome at the table of Jesus. And Jesus wept. We need to get back to Jesus. That's why here at Life Journey, all are welcome at the Lord's table. It's not our idea, it's Jesus' idea. Do this in remembrance of me. So, why did Jesus instruct us to observe Holy Communion throughout the ages as his followers? Number one, Holy Communion is meant to remind us to live life as a love feast, connecting to the people around us deeply and inclusively, just as Jesus did. Do this in remembrance of me. But we can't stop there, because communion is like a Russian nesting doll. It has multiple layers of meaning. Communion, Holy Communion, is also meant to remind us, number two, to remember what Jesus did for us on the cross and to share that same sacrificial love. The breaking of the bread reminds us that Jesus' body was broken for us. The raising of the cup reminds us that Jesus' blood was poured out for us in death. Jesus gave his life for us. He didn't have to. Jesus told his disciples, if I were to give the word, my Father would send 10,000 angels and whisk me out of here. Instead, he chose to die alone for you and me. He gave his life so that we might live. He became the sacrificial lamb who paid the just penalty for my sins and yours. As you are well aware, on this past July 4, there was a mass shooting at a parade in Chicago's Highland Park. Two of the people who were there at the parade that day were Kevin and Irina McCarthy. They were there with their 2.5-year-old son, Aiden. They happened to be standing in the crowd that was initially targeted by the shooter. As soon as the gunshots began firing in rapid fashion, targeting that area of the crowd, instinctively, Kevin grabbed his 2.5-year-old son, thrust him to the ground, and then draped his body over him. He, Kevin, was struck with a bullet that ripped through his femur. He bled out and died. Irina was also shot and died. When the gunshots finally ceased, little Aiden crawled out from under his father, covered in his blood, and stunned began wandering the sidewalk. A woman, herself wounded, noticed him and picked him up, but she, the woman, was struggling to herself survive. So as soon as she saw another couple, she handed the little boy off to this young couple and said, "Please take care of him. I don't know who he belongs to." And then that woman, collapsed. That couple ended up taking Aiden to the fire station, and ultimately he was reunited with his grandparents, who will now raise him. Someday, when Aiden is old enough to understand, his grandparents will tell him the story of what his father did for him. How his dad gave his life so that he, Aiden, could fully live his. And once Aiden knows that story, do you think there will ever be a day in the rest of his life when he does not, at least at one point during that day, stop and express his thanks and his gratitude and wonder at what his father did for him? He gave his life so that Aiden might fully live. That is what Jesus Christ did for us. We are, so to speak, covered by his blood. Jesus Christ gave his life for us so that we might live fully. Shouldn't we, every day, at least one meal during the day, pause and remember and give thanks and gratitude and be in awe of what Jesus Christ has done with us? Whether it's you eating alone or you eating with a group of people, shouldn't we make that remembrance a part of our daily practice, a daily reminder of Jesus' incredible sacrificial love? And even as we do that, it becomes a powerful reminder that we, as Jesus followers, are now called to turn around and share that same kind of sacrificial love with others. We should be the kind of people who are characterized by sacrificial love. Do this in remembrance of me. Early one morning, a mom was making pancakes for her 2 little boys, Kevin, 5, and Ryan, 3 years old. As she was making the pancakes, the 2 boys got into an argument about who was going to get the first pancake. Seeing an opportunity to teach them an important spiritual lesson, Mom said, "Boys, if Jesus were here, Jesus would say, 'My brother can have the first pancake.'" Kevin, 5 years old, thought about this for a second, then turns to his little brother and says, "Ryan, you be Jesus." It's wonderful when somebody else is Jesus to us, but it can be tough to be Jesus to the people around us. I was in Walmart, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, grocery shopping. So I was walking down one of the aisles. There was a $20 bill laying on the floor. I picked it up and immediately thought to myself, what would Jesus do? And that's when it hit me. I turned it into wine. Water into. Okay, that didn't really happen. But you get the point. What would Jesus do? That's a hard question. It's wonderful when people are Jesus to us. It's hard to share that kind of sacrificial love with others. We need the strength of Christ. We need daily reminders that as followers of Jesus, we are called to engage in the same kind of sacrificial love in our life. Once a day, whether you're alone by yourself or whether you're with others, pause somewhere in your meal and remember Jesus. Let's live our faith. So, to recap, Holy Communion is meant to remind us, number one, to live life as a love feast, connecting to people around us deeply and inclusively as Jesus did. And number two, to remember what Jesus did for us on the cross and to share that same sacrificial love. And finally, lastly, number three, Holy Communion is also meant to remind us to remember that Jesus is always with us. The very last sentence Jesus spoke before he ascended into heaven after his crucifixion and resurrection, the last sentence Jesus spoke, Matthew 28:20, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Today's gospel passage that you heard Sharon read earlier from Luke 24 is meant to drive that point home. It tells us how two of Jesus' followers, 3 days after his crucifixion, needed to make the journey, the 7-mile journey from Jerusalem to Ephesus. And as they were journeying on foot, they were commiserating and grieving the loss of Jesus. And there's this stranger, Jesus, but they don't know it. There's this stranger who comes along who overhears them and asks them, "Why are you so sad?" And they proceed to tell this stranger, Jesus, that they had believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah and they had such high hope, but now he was killed, so they must have been wrong. And that's when Jesus, this stranger, begins to explain to them the messianic prophecies that predicted that the Messiah was going to suffer, that this was part of the divine plan for the Messiah. And as the stranger was sharing these Old Testament prophecies with these two disciples, the text says that there was a burning in their hearts. It was like there was electricity in the air. They sensed that something special was taking place, was happening. And then when they finally got to Emmaus, the stranger said, "I'm going to walk on a bit further." But the sun was setting, and so they said to him, No, you must be exhausted. Why don't you stay the night with us? Later that evening, as they sit down at the table to share a meal together, the stranger takes bread, breaks it, blesses it, and gives it to them with the exact same mannerisms as Jesus himself had done. It was uncanny. It was spooky. And then the stranger took the cup and blessed it and gave it to him the same exact way Jesus had done it. And that's when a light bulb went off. Luke chapter 24, verse 31. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized that this was Jesus himself, the risen Christ. And instantly he vanished from their sight. Jesus was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Holy Communion is meant to remind us that Jesus is present with you at every meal you eat and at every point in between. In Jewish tradition, at sacred meals, they will set out an empty chair, and they call it Elijah's chair there at the table, to remind them that the spirit of Elijah is there with them. Holy Communion is meant to serve a similar function for us as Christians. When we remember Holy Communion in our meals, we are reminded that Jesus is there. This week, practice it. Maybe you're at breakfast. Look at one of the empty chairs there at the table and envision Jesus present with you. Do this in remembrance of me. You heard the story that Janine shared at the outset of the sermon. How at age 15, struggling with suicidal thoughts, working at the House of Pie in a little town in Illinois, a stranger wanders in and sits down at the counter, She described him to me as an old, scraggly man. He asks for a drink. She gets it for him. They make conversation. He orders a piece of pie. But before she goes to get his pie, out of the blue, he says to her, I know what you're thinking. Don't do it. God has something big you're supposed to do in your life. As Janine relayed this story to me, she told me that I just thought he was some crazy old man. She said, I turned around to the serving window, I guess, to get the piece of pie for the man. Turned back around, she said, and he had vanished. Gone. She looked at the manager and said, did you see that? They couldn't figure out what had happened to him. Big windows at the front of the restaurant. Where did he go? How did he? The stranger vanished. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus is present every time we sit at meal and at all points in between. Imagine if I got in the habit of once a day at one of our meals, pausing to remind ourselves of that. Talk about a shift in consciousness. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, who's right here with me every moment of every day. Start practicing that and see if it doesn't change everything. Sisters and brothers, let's live our faith.